Okay. I'm very well aware that this is going to be an unpopular opinions video. Unfortunately, I think as of now it will be. I think that in the future it will not be. But so I watched the finale of X-Men '97, and I wanted to give myself time to think about it because I've been wanting to do this series review ever since the whole thing came out. I mean, since it started, and be able to really gather my thoughts and do a video on the thing as a whole, because I was really passionate about getting a new X-Men thing after all of these years, especially one based off of what was supposed to be based off of one of my favorite cartoons of all time. And I wrote down a script for it, but honestly, I realized that the script was just getting to be too long, and that if I was to write a script down going over all my thoughts over everything, it would just go on for a very, very, very long time. And I realized that I just had to get this out there, so I'll just use what I already wrote down as my notes. But the X-Men '97 has been getting a lot of praise, and here's my thing. I think that as fans, we are starved. I think as Marvel fans, we are starved of anything that seems to care about the source of who these characters are, because we've seen it. We've seen with directors who don't care about these characters, who try to change it into things that they're not. We've seen it with changing the tone of Marvel, people who haven't read or liked the source material. So, and with X-Men, with the Fox universe, they had very little in there that was good. I mean, I think that it's understated just how inaccurate to the comics and what worked about the comics the Fox universe was. And we haven't gotten anything X-Men in so many years. So I understand that we're all starving for something entertaining, anything that adheres to these characters. And, look how I was when this show started. I was so hyped about it. I was so on board with it. Even at some points in my reviews, I said this is like the best thing since Infinity War. But as I say before, what matters most about something is the ending. And I wouldn't disagree that this is the best thing that Marvel has put out in a while, but that isn't a very high bar. The thing is, as everyone is just praising this as a 10 out of 10 show and not accepting any criticisms of it, I'm looking back at the narrative as a whole and just seeing a whole lot of problems. And I know that that's blasphemous, but let hear me out, because at the same time I feel like the problems in this show are very, very obvious to point out, and why I just can't agree with people that this is a peak X-Men show. And I just see a whole lot wrong with it, especially where they went with. And this should be a little disclaimer. Criticizing a show does not mean I'm telling you can't like the show. It means I'm seeing a whole lot of problems with it, and it's in tampering with me finding this a good show as a whole. And so you can still like the show all you want, but what I'm getting into here is the obvious flaws with it, and why I think that this still is not peak X-Men, or why it might not necessarily be a great continuation of the original series, and why I still think we can do a lot better with this. But before we get into that, let's get into the positives. So the positives about this show, first of all, are Cyclops and Jean Grey. If you are a Cyclops and Jean Grey fan, then I think that you will be very satisfied with this series. Cyclops is really reinvigorated as a character. Now, that is one thing that I think could have stood some improvement from the original cartoon series. Cyclops was very stiff in that show. In this show, he's very dynamic. Like, he's got that Boy Scout element to him, but he's not Captain America. He's more flawed, and you really get him as a whole. I think that the voice actor just did a fantastic job with him, his personality in this series. I think Jean Grey was equally great. I think that the way that they handled the Madeline Pryor stuff was overall rushed, but I thought that the idea of it, taking a very controversial storyline, one that assassinated Cyclops' character in the comics. For those who don't know, in the comics, it made him marry Madeline Pryor and then leave her for Jean, leave her and Nate for Jean when he found out she was alive. But this show fixes that, and it makes it so that it wasn't his fault. He was essentially a victim. And so if they ever adapt like the Madeline Pryor stuff in anything after this, I think that this is a good legacy of the show, that they should do it the way the show did, where Scott is a victim rather than the person who was acting out of character to get there. And like I said, Jean is very well done in the show. personality-wise. And other characters, I think that Nightcrawler was done really well in the show. I appreciate them giving a little bit more of his jokey side that we haven't seen. So many adaptations of him have just portrayed him as, stiff. But Nightcrawler here is able to keep the religious aspects of his characters, but also the jokey aspects. I'm really glad that they kept him around, and I was really entertained whenever he came on screen. But I honestly thought that the best character in this entire show was Gambit. And AJ Lacasio, I just thought that he did an incredible job with getting barely any time, while he was alive at least. And I have my theories as to why he was made the designated cannon fodder, but I'll keep them to myself for now. For what we got of him, it was just like such a good adaptation of the character, such a good voice. I loved whatever limited screen time that he had. I would also like to say that I think that the animation in this show is really great. Some people criticize the animation most of all, but I thought through and through it was really great. I mean, you can pick out some gaffes here and there, but I just thought it was really great to look at through and through, especially in the action sequences. If you really slow down the action sequences, you can see how they're well choreographed with the moves and the decisions that characters make, and I just think that it actually looks really stunning. So I really enjoyed the animation in this show. And like I said, it's nice to be able to feel like you are back in the world of Marvel. Like, after it seems like people have been trying to get away from it, and the Fox universes seemed like they were embarrassed by their source material. It's nice to feel like this is the world of Marvel, and this is the universe that it works in, and that people do care about the comic book source material, and they know what they're pulling from. But that in and of itself comes to what I think is the biggest problem with the show. And so now I'm going to get into the negatives. And the negatives is there's just so much shoved into this show, and it's basically like 5 seasons of plot in 10 episodes. And they try to adapt so many comic book storylines. They're adapting Inferno, Trial of Magneto, Operation Zero Tolerance, Life Death, Fatal Attractions, E for Extinction, along with that and original storylines that they're trying to develop for this 10 episode season, and all that ask for screen time, and the characters, all the new characters they're bringing in that are asking for screen time. Some of these storylines that they're pulling from are an omnibus worth of comics. Some of them could be an entire season of their own. Some of them could be an entire movie of their own, but it's all of them shoved at once. And the result is that this is one of the most overstuffed shows that I've seen in a long time, and that does something very, very drastic to the show's pacing. And the problem here is not that X-Men 97 is too fast-paced with all the stuff it's adapting, it's that X-Men 97 essentially has no pace. Seriously, some storylines feel like they're on fast forward, some stories feel like we're spending too much time on them, some things feel like they didn't need to be there in the first place, while other elements will appear and then completely disappear as quickly as they're introduced. I think the most obvious one for this that people noticed was the handling of Storm's life-death storyline, and this is a very long, very emotional arc from the comics, and I thought that it was going to be a slam dunk and be one of the most powerful elements of the show. But what they choose to do is split it up into half episodes across 2 other episodes in the season, so they have to share episodes with other storylines. And even in the second one, even though it's called Life Death Part 2, it's actually a show about Charles Xavier. And the result is it's so rushed, it comes off as embarrassing in some points, like when you have Ford seemingly meet Storm in one scene, and then 5 minutes or even a minute later, he's declaring his eternal love for her, and it's just so cringe. And then, but later than what could have been much more emotionally impactful moments in an exploration of this character doesn't land because it's all so rushed. And they are changing Storm a bit from the comics so that now she resents herself for being a mutant, even though I don't think the character ever would do that. It seems like they're just changing her to fit into their own narrative, and I might be able to get behind that for a new version, but we just barely spend any time with her. And after this, for a character who can fly, she should have rejoined her friends immediately, but she inexplicably stays away for a while before she comes back in the finale, and then barely does anything there. So, it's an example of how they're not able to handle all their storylines, and they're not able to handle their characters. I mean, talk about in a minute, there's an element of this show where both Morph and Rogue get hit by the same beam, but for some reason Rogue is the only one who stays out for an entire episode and there's no explanation. And well, it's because they needed to write her to the side because they didn't have anything to do with her just then, and they can't handle their cast. And some people might say that this is the fault of Disney for not giving them enough time, but first of all, for me, like, time limits for writers on books or comics or shows, they've always been a thing. The executives at hand will give you exactly how much time you have to tell a story, and it's your job as a writer to be able to decide, to use wisdom of can you adapt all of this? Can you do on this in such little time? And I see it more of the show's problem where it's pushing in so much unnecessarily because it just wants to adapt so much and achieve so much at once that it's collapsing in on itself. I mean, there's things in here that just didn't need to be here. Like, there's characters like Morph, who does nothing essentially throughout the season except do cameos, that didn't need to be here. We'll talk about other characters in a second, but there's plot lines like, Jubilee's birthday episode, which doesn't seem to be entirely relevant to the series. They try to tie it in thematically, but it was such a half-baked message, and it was really, really preachy that it just came off as embarrassing once again. Or the second part of Storm's episode, where you have that entire thing. We spend most of the episode on Charles Xavier's impending marriage to Lilandra, but that ends up not having any meaning to the overall show. And it's like, so why did we waste our precious time on that? But to me, the worst done characters in this entire show were Sunspot and Rogue. Now, Sunspot is a character who, when he started, and this was more of a mundane superhero show, I liked him. And I mean, Sunspot is a character who, in particular, I'm not super familiar with from the comics because I haven't read New Mutants, but I liked him fine when he started out. But then, as the show changed its tone suddenly and became a much more darker, more epic thing, it felt like his mundane storyline about not being able to come out as a mutant to his parents, it felt like it didn't fit. It felt like he had no connection to anyone except Jubilee, who also wasn't really written with much connection to anything. She was just like written off to the side, and it just felt really, really tacked on. But he goes from not being able to come out to a mutant, to be a mutant, to his mother betraying him, not having any connection to the X-Men or wanting one, to joining with Magneto in his declared genocide of the entire Earth. And now this is an important point that we have to hammer home. Magneto has set off an EMP, and the show says that he's killed thousands. No, he would have killed millions with that EMP. Millions of mutants as well. So, but the show does not acknowledge that. But so he's according to the show, somehow there is a way for Magneto to reverse his EMP, which I don't know how that works. But if he doesn't, then essentially the Earth's magnetic field or ozone field or something is going to be destroyed, something like that. But essentially, he's going to wipe out all life on Earth. And that's going to mean humans, animals, and mutants. He's going to wipe out everyone, essentially. So Roberto goes from not having any part of this to his mother betraying him to him deciding, I'm going to join this mass murdering terrorist in his genocide of the entire Earth. And so that's crazy. And then Rogue, once again, I thought she was just done really badly throughout the entire show, where she's nothing but a background character who barely has anything to do in the first half of it. She's not really a character at all. What we did get, I felt, was out of character, which is why I was against them doing the whole Magneto Rogue thing, which they did not make any better from the comics. They made it, I'm going to say something positive about Magneto and Rogue now. I would gladly read what they are in the comics compared to what they do with them in the show, but that's beside the point right now. Did not feel like she was well done. And then the reason, like, people misinterpreted the reason for why I didn't like her joining Magneto was because I can't stand seeing the character do anything bad. No, I felt like this was taking the character beyond the point of no return to have her, disparage her friends and join with the guy who is about to wipe up everyone, including her own people. She says she's joining with him because she won't see any more mutants die, but he's about to kill all the mutants on Earth as well. And I'm like, there's no way that you're going to be able to come back from this. But then in the next episode, at the end of this episode, Roberto and Rogue see Magneto rip Wolverine's skeleton right out for him, and you're like, this is going to have major consequences. But in the next episode, they just act like the Rogue and Roberto betrayal never happened. Like Like, Rogue is just back to normal. Like, everyone was defending her decision to join Magneto. Oh, she's just consumed with this unbridled grief and rage. But it's not even that, there's no scene of her going, oh my goodness, what have I done? There's no scene of catharsis, of her realizing what Gambit would want or something like that. There's no explanation for either Roberto or Rogue. They're just back on the team. There's no hard feelings. No one mentions it. They don't behave as though it just happened. Rogue is in the best of spirits, just happily fighting on the people that she should have been fighting in the first place. And it's like, it feels like there's scenes missing. It's like, what happened here? And what is going on? Why would they do this dramatic scene of these characters betraying their friends for questionable reasons in the first place if they weren't going to do anything with that? And the answer is because Beau DeMayo wanted to reference the Fatal Attraction storyline from the comics where Colossus betrays his friends. But the difference there is, you see in the comics, Colossus, once he realizes his mistake, doesn't instantly have all of his grief evaporate, and he doesn't instantly become buddies with everyone again. No, he feels like he has to atone for that. There's still a lot of negative feelings in him. And that's because that's what happens when you're writing a story naturally and you're doing a natural progression. But this story doesn't have that. It feels like they just wanted their comic book reference, and then when it was convenience, they forgot about it. It's crazy. And there's more to that later, but I mean, beyond that, though, like I said, the show doesn't want to, like we see Logan getting his skeleton ripped out, but the show doesn't want to accept consequences. And it's ironic because Beau DeMayo said behind the scenes that this is a show all about consequences, but it seems that those consequences will disappear whenever he needs them to. For example, Magneto has not just killed thousands. He would have killed millions of people with his EMP. He's been fighting the X-Men for years and doing all these horrible things. He was about to genocide the entire Earth, essentially. He rips out a man's skeleton from him, and then he's doing all of these heinous things. But then in this episode, in this finale, apparently all that needs to happen is for Charles to sit in his mind and talk to him, and it's better. And Magneto gets to a point where he decides that he wants to save the Earth, and that now he's just buddies with everyone again. And it's like, what is going on here? And it was so confusing, but it got even worse as I thought about it, because I'm like, what are they trying to say with all of this? And it goes back to that scene with Magneto and Rogue in episode 2, where she says that he wore the helmet that apparently blocked out Charles's mind from him because he didn't want to feel Charles's love for him, or he wouldn't be able to do what he does. And I'm okay. First of all, that wasn't a thing in the original show because it wasn't a thing in the comics. Magneto's helmet did not block out Charles Xavier's mind originally, and you see that in the show. That was something invented in the movies because they just wanted an explanation for why Charles just couldn't detect Magneto. So it was supposed to make it so that Magneto couldn't be found out. This show is retconning it in and making it out about as if Magneto wore the helmet in order to block out Charles's love for him so that he wouldn't change, so he would keep on his rampage. And so now that it's off, now everything, all of this conflict with Magneto, all the things that he's done, all the fighting, all of the mass murder is over because Charles got to spend some time with Magneto in his head and talking about his problems. And I'm sorry. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. It's crazy. It's just craziness, and it just comes off as the writer's bias, because if you follow Beau DeMayo on Twitter, he's been tweeting constantly, and it really gives insight into how he thinks for this show. He loves Magneto, and he's talked about how he really identifies with the character. So that's why I think that the show really, really tries to make Magneto as sympathetic and understandable as possible. That's why I think that it gives him so much leeway with everything, with plot armor for how he survived, which, by the way, is never actually explained in the show how he survived Genosha. He just has plot armor, why everyone is so forgiving to him, why the show leans into his ideology so much, which we'll get into in a second. But that just exposes the bias of the writer, not the logical. And I think that the bias is exposed by the fact that he needed to have the Fatal Attractions reference here because he's talked about how that's his favorite storyline of all time. Other things that expose the bias of the writer is this Jean and and Storm friendship that's really pushed hard. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with making Jean and Storm really close friends. That's the thing in the comics. But the problem is, it wasn't a thing in the original show. Like, Storm was close with Rogue in the original show, and she was close with Gambit. And so you'd think that maybe more naturally in the story, maybe you would give Storm and Rogue a moment where Storm comes back and is able to help her come out of her grief, so we could actually see this character's arc complete on screen and actually feel more natural. I thought we were going to get stuff with, like, does Rogue feel really guilty that she basically broke Gambit's heart before he died? Is that what's adding to her grief on top of that? But we never get any of that explored. With Rogue's storyline, it feels like this is this massive story arc that you want to tell, this massively emotional story arc, but it's like we don't actually, it's like most of it plays off screen and it doesn't make sense, and she's inconsistent. But like, why didn't you have a scene where Storm reacts to Gambit's death, or a scene where Storm is able to bring Rogue out of her misery, and maybe the big scene of Rogue's catharsis could be her rejecting Magneto's offer to join them, or maybe we have a scene with Sunspot where he admits that he should join the team because he just can't he has nowhere else to go. But we don't get any of that. But we do get these, scenes of Jean and Storm being the best of friends, even though they weren't really seen that way in the original show. We get scenes of betrayal that don't really go anywhere, and it just seems like the writer's bias again, because he's made it very clear online that he really likes Jean and Storm's friendship, and that appears to be why he's laying it on so thick, even though there's other things that would have been more beneficial to the narrative to develop. I don't think that Sunspot really needed to be in the show at all, for example. And it's like, we can't have a scene of Rogue overcoming her grief, actually having a catharsis. We can't have scenes that actually explain how Magneto survived Genosha. We can't have scenes that have Storm actually react to Gambit's death. But we can't have a scene of Bastion shaving Magneto, which didn't go anywhere. I thought it was going to go somewhere. I thought, oh, maybe he's transforming him into something. No, it's inexplicable why Bastion even kept Magneto alive, presumably, because he just ruined everything. And that's the problem with this show. It's like I can never count on anything that's going to happen. It sporadically changes at the moment, and I'm not even sure, because so much of it is so scarcely developed. I'm not sure how much of it is because the writers forgot about something, or because it's just moving along so fast that they had to cut so much out, and because they have to stuff so much in. And that, unfortunately, leads to the themes of the show as well. And this show has a lot of themes in it about, tragedy, bigotry, obviously, and how people deal with it. Some individual episodes I thought did do a good job of that, but the problem is when you get to the end and the overall point of it, for episode upon episode, even going back to episode 4 with Jubilee's birthday, this show was really trying to push the idea that Magneto is right, and that his bleak ideology is actually correct, and that we always will put ourselves into these situations of mass murder and bigotry, and that maybe violence against that is and tyranny is the only way to come against it. It seemed that the show was pushing that so hard, especially with characters like Cyclops and Beast seemingly losing their way, starting to believe in Magneto's ideology. It just seemed to be pushing that so hard, and that's part of what made the show feel so bleak. And I wasn't a fan of that, but that was the direction. But then when we get to the last episode, it's like everything's completed by Cyclops just all of a sudden has this sort of friendship speech with Bastion, the guy who murdered all these mutants, the guy who murdered their close friend. He just gives him a really understanding speech about family and empathy and all that, and it just felt like it was out of nowhere, and that it hadn't been built up to or supported by the season at all, and it was honestly kind of cringe. And Rogue has gone from wanting to betray all her friends and wanting to genocide the Earth over Gambit to perfectly dealing with Gambit's death perfectly fine, to now she's going there and actually encouraging Bastion to listen to Cyclops. And it's this guy who she was just pummeling and wanting to get revenge on because he killed Gambit. And it's like, there's no consistency in this entire show. Like, even thematically, it's just all so random, and it just goes wherever the show wants it to go. And it's just so crazy. Like None of it makes any sense. And, just to give an example of just how sporadic this show is, for example, they keep really pushing this Magneto Rogue thing. And once again, they made it far worse than in the comics. But I understood what they were doing with him as soon as I saw Bo DeMayo's tweets about how much he loves AOA Age of Apocalypse, how much he loves the idea of Rogue and Magneto as a power couple. And I'm like, that's the problem that I understand now with the show is you're not adapting the 616 versions of these characters, you're adapting Age of Apocalypse, where Rogue was a completely different character in order to just facilitate the role of Magneto's wife, and where Magneto was a good person in that universe. But so that said, I don't like that they're continuing with that, but I don't know how they are going to. I don't know if Magneto and Rogue are going to be in a platonic relationship, like Magneto accepts her decision to reject him. I don't know if Magneto is still going to try to pursue Rogue. I don't know if Rogue is going to think that Gambit is dead, so maybe she should go with this guy. I don't know if they're going to make it so Rogue marries Magneto and has a child with him before she can get back to Gambit, like happened in the AOA universe. I wouldn't put it past Bo DeMayo to do that, but I don't know if they're going to just forget that Magneto Rogue plotline happened at all, or if this stuff with the alternate timelines is going to take up half an episode or an entire season, because that's just how non-paced this show is. There's no pace whatsoever. There's no consistency, and that's what frustrated me to the point where I'm just so turned off by it, because it's like I can end one episode seeing these plot lines and thinking that there's a way that's they're going to go and want to see the payoff for that before things are forgotten or go in a completely different direction, because there's just nothing consistent with it. And people can talk about the flaws of X-Men 92 or X-Men Evolution or Wolverine and the X-Men, the animated shows that have come out prior to this, and they definitely had their flaws, but with each of those shows, they're at least consistent with what they are. They're far more consistent with what they are than this show. And, I just think that we're all on a high because we really wanted to get something that was accurate to the comics, and it is, but it's to the point where there's so much stuffed in and so much of it that doesn't even add up with the 90s show even. It's just the writer's preference, so much that he shoehorned, I would say, even just for his own, fanboyism, because he wanted to see it, that so little of it makes any sense. And it's really turned me off for the show, because I would want the next season to streamline it and not have so much in it at once and not be pushing that so hard. I hope that there's changes, but as of now, I'm just not seeing this as the brilliant masterpiece that people think it is. Does it have its high points? Yes, but the low lows really undercut what it was trying to do, in my opinion. I don't know how you can make a show about consequences when the consequences will evaporate as soon as you need them to. I don't know how you can say that, how you need to be really careful about respecting the lore of the original show when you'll retcon things in just because they're your personal preference. I don't know why Bo DeMayo was fired for sure, but just looking at him as a professional and people praising him as some genius, I don't really see it. Like, I'm just going to go back to what somebody in the comments said about this show while I was reviewing it, is that they think that the paradox with this show is it's written by people who actually care about the comics but aren't that skilled as writers. And I would agree with that, because there's just not a lot of discernment in the show of, like, maybe we don't need to adapt all of this at once. Maybe we need to focus on just making this the most coherent, impactful story that we can, rather than shoving all of this in. And I think that is what went on with this show. And the reason why I want to speak on that is because I still think that there is so much better that we could do with the X-Men. Like, I would actually prefer going back to X-Men Evolution and X-Men 92 over this show. And I think that, people saying this should be a blueprint for the movies. I'm like, I would hope that a movie could be more cohesive than this, because here's what I think is going to happen with this show. I think it's going to be that people are really praising it as a 10 out of 10 now because they're on a hype from all the highs, but I think as time passes, the flaws are going to come through and it's not going to be as great to revisit. And so, unfortunately, that's what I got to say about this show. I appreciate that them getting people who actually cared about the comics to work on it, but I don't think that this is the best representation of that. In the movies, in the Dark Knight movies, in the Avengers, in movies and like that, we saw a better balance of people who were able to respect the source material but also know what they were doing. And what we really need is balance going forward. But yeah, so that's why X-Men 97 frustrated me and ultimately disappointed me. And I mean, look at the high I was when this show first came out. I wasn't willing to look at any of its flaws because I was just on such a hype from it. But I think that it's not going to really hold up. And I still want to push for better with these characters. But that is all I got for you guys today. I hope that even if you disagree, you can at least see where my criticisms are coming from. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you, patrons, as always, for supporting. And I will see you guys next time.